And now we're going to kind of move into a lifespan a bit. And our next speaker is Erik Carter, who many of you know. I heard somebody say this morning, overheard a conversation, that he says, my two books that I recommend to people are Erik Carter's book and The Mennonite Supportive Care in the Congregation, and that those are my Bibles, other than the Bible. And that's, I think, is the case for many of us, out of the breadth of Erik's work with that book, but also if you want somebody who can design a research study on the back of a napkin in 10 minutes, he's it. He'll hopefully will tell you about some of the exciting things that he's doing, and we'll tell you during the week about some things we had hoped for that we didn't quite get to make, which was a research study, for instance, on what do we learn about prayer from people whom other people don't think can pray. Anyway, Erik Carter from Nashville.
There we go. Well, good morning. It's a pleasure to join you this morning and to sit on the edge of a week among so many different people who care so deeply about creating communities where people with and without disabilities can worship and learn and serve and fellowship and live life right alongside each other. You're going to discover really quickly that I wear a bit of a different hat from the other speakers that you're going to hear from this week. I'm an educational intervention researcher now at Vanderbilt University, where much of my work really focuses on identifying those skills and supports and opportunities and relationships that young people with significant disabilities need to live a rich, full life, to participate fully in the life of their community. And the bulk of that work has really focused on creating inclusive schools and inclusive workplaces. But when you spend time talking with young people, those conversations quickly turn to things that matter, like families, like friendships, and like faith. And so in my time this morning, what I want to do is share with you just a glimpse of what my colleagues and I at Vanderbilt are learning about the practice of faith and the place of congregational connections in the lives of young people with developmental disabilities and their families. And if the term developmental disabilities isn't familiar to you, I'm talking about those members of our communities and our families who we often talk about in terms of having Down syndrome or autism or Fragile X syndrome or Williams syndrome or a variety of other disabilities. Within professional circles, they're often people who we talk about in terms of their need for extensive supports or their cognitive impairments or often their complex communication challenges. But within schools and workplaces, and I think too often in congregations, they're people who really aren't well known at all. And so this morning what I want to do is start as any effective speaker would do at an institute centered on theology and turn first to some of our sacred texts. And I put some of those on your were you expecting different texts? What do we learn about the gifts of people with disabilities, of developmental disabilities and their families, and the place and prominence of faith in their lives when we look at our professional journals and our books? And despite the fact that we have many wonderfully crafted position statements on the importance of supporting spirituality and religious expression among people with disabilities and their families, many of these journals have very few studies that focus on this dimension of people's lives. And I worry about what our professionals and service providers that we're training will take away from this pretty striking omission. And so it's not surprising that if you have conversations with professionals, they often struggle to discover and support what really brings life to the individuals that they serve. And their questions are often quite familiar. Is faith really something that's important to them? How would I even know that? Is it really my role to support them in this dimension of their life? And how do I put these policy statements that we have right into practice? And at the same time, a large number of denominations and faith groups, perhaps yours, have also approved or passed very compelling position statements and resolutions articulating a strong call for why congregations should be places of hospitality and sanctuary and community for people with disabilities, just as they should be for all people. And I've compiled a lot of these in my book. I've put a few on the screen, some of these position statements. Don't try to read them. But I think we spend relatively little time talking to young people with disabilities and their families about their faith stories, about the gifts that they have to share, about their hopes for their congregations, and the ways in which they've either felt warmly welcomed or very deeply wounded by their encounters with congregations. It's not surprising that many congregation leaders also struggle to support what they know brings life to individuals in their community, including people with disabilities. And their questions are also familiar. Is faith really something that's important to them? What would it look like for us to support youth with disabilities and their families well in their faith journey? And how do we put these calls into practice? So what I want to do is take you away from here for just a short time. We're going to travel down to Tennessee. And you're going to learn a little bit about what my students and I are learning from families who are participating in a project on faith and flourishing in the lives of young people with disabilities. This past spring, we launched a study that's really looking at the strengths of young people with disabilities, as opposed to the deficits that our field often perseverates on. We're looking at the place of faith in their lives, about the ways in which their strengths and their faith might coalesce and contribute to their own flourishing, and about the ways that their parents, the hopes that their parents have for their congregations, and the ways that those congregations might better support families and youth with disabilities. And I originally had a very different talk in mind for this gathering, but why instead did I choose to share these data with you? Well, many of you are already holding leadership roles where you're instrumental in shaping the response of congregations in your community, or maybe even around the country. Some of you are involved in setting the vision for your congregation or your entire denomination. You may be writing resources for clergy or lay leaders, or you may be part of doing that theological work that Hans referenced. So hearing about the experiences and the hopes and aspirations of young people with disabilities and their families might really spur and inform your work. But I think some of you may also not be very familiar with the everyday experiences of young people with intellectual disabilities or autism in your communities and in your congregations. And so while these data that I'll share with you are no way nationally representative, I do think that they'll prompt you to think about a number of key issues that have relevance for the families and people in your own communities. So our project is going to involve as many as 500 families across all of Tennessee. And in this very first phase, what we're doing is reaching wide across the state to invite parents of young people who are between the ages of 13 and 21. They're completing a series of questionnaires and measures that focus on strengths and support needs and spiritual expressions and congregational involvement and well-being, as well as these parents' perceptions of their congregation's welcome and support for them and their child. As of 3 days ago, as of Friday, we had 242 families who had already participated. We're waiting to hear back from about 100 more who are in the process of preparing this information. So let me start by sharing with you a little bit about the young people who are the focus of this project. All right? Our project focused on youth and young adults with intellectual disabilities and autism. You might be surprised that there are 6 million Americans who share that label. That's 2 to 3% of any single community around the country or around the world. 150 million people with developmental disabilities around the world. 1 in every 88 Americans has autism. You've seen the commercials, I'm sure. 1 in 54 boys. And so the figures in the corner of each of the screens really reflect the percentage of participants in our project who have those different demographics. About half of the families have an adolescent child with intellectual disability, 41% a child with autism or some other developmental disability. And in our state, just as in your state, these families live in every single community across our state, stretching the 540 miles from the southern delta of Memphis all the way to the Appalachian Hills of Mountain City. And in fact, according to the U.S. Census, 30% of all families across our country have at least one relative with some disability. That's 21 million families who reside in every single city. Pick any single neighborhood, knock on every fourth door, and you're likely to find a family who's touched by disability in some way. Could be these doors, who knows? And developmental disability cuts across every demographic group, whether that community is defined ethnically or culturally or geographically or in any other way. It cuts across every demographic group. So in our project, the demographics of youth largely reflect the demographics of Tennessee as well. And these are young people who have brothers and sisters who love them, who pick on them, who worry about them, who who live life alongside them, and that's true for most of the youth in our project. And I highlight this because disability can impact an entire family, and you'll probably hear about that from some of the other speakers this week, from Rudd Turnbull and Katie Arnold and Amy Becker. But siblings are often an enduring source of support in the lives of their brother or sister with a disability, and so congregations really might consider how they extend support and embrace to those siblings as well. And I think there'll be a workshop on this on Wednesday focused on sibling support. And moreover, consistent with national data, more than 1 out of every 4 youth lives in a family with earnings below the poverty level. And so we know that people with significant disabilities are 3 times more likely to live in poverty. So the challenge for us is to think beyond Sunday morning and the difference that people of faith can make in addressing the range of issues that are introduced by poverty as well. And like everyone else in these communities, these youth who are part of our project attend their local middle school or high school. It's a right that's guaranteed to them under federal law. A right, as you know, doesn't extend to their local congregation. But nearly half of these youth spend almost all of their days in the very same classes as their peers without disabilities. The rest spend some time of their day in special education classrooms. And some of these youth are going to need quite a bit of extra support in their schools. For about half of these young people, that support comes in the form of a paraprofessional or a one-to-one special education assistant. And some of these youth might need that kind of support to participate in your religious education programs or your youth groups. And some, but not nearly all, of these young people exhibit challenging behaviors, things that really stretch the expectations and norms of a given setting. We found that in our sample, about 12% of the parents said their youth often, and 26% that said their youth sometimes exhibited some type of challenging behaviors. And that can really stretch our creativity when it comes to designing supports around these young people in congregational life. And as you'll see in a few moments, the presence of those challenging behaviors really impacts faith community involvement. So what's important to know about the strengths and faith of these young people who live in each of our communities in Tennessee, in your communities around the country and around the world, and perhaps are connected to your own congregation? So, prepare ye for the data. Have you had your coffee? Here we go. Here's a bit about what we learned from these parents and how they see their children's disabilities and the strengths that they notice. We asked these parents to complete something called the Assessment Scale for Positive Character Traits. If you're unsure what your own strengths are, I can administer the scale to you in about 10 minutes afterwards. I'll tell you exactly what they are. But this is a measure that includes 26 statements. It addresses things like the extent to which the child shows characteristics like kindness and humor, and gratitude or empathy, optimism, forgiveness, or courage. Why does that matter so much? Well, think about how we often talk about developmental disabilities, or perhaps all disabilities, always in terms of what someone cannot or will struggle to do. I put some of the definitions on the screen, and you can see they're so deficit-based in terms of how we define disabilities. So when a congregation is considering the question, well, how do we welcome someone with autism? Or how do we include this young person with an intellectual disability in our youth group? And all they have to work from is the image of what a person with that label can't do. You imagine that's a very challenging introduction. It's hard to find a place in our congregation for a list of deficits, in a sense. And this is something I think John McKnight will talk about on Friday. How we introduce people really matters. It really does make a difference. So what if instead of introducing people by a disability label or a particular set of deficits, what if instead we introduced young people by the strengths and the gifts that they had to bring to a community, much like Hans was talking about earlier? Can we think of young people with disabilities in this way? Well, their parents can. I've pulled just a few items from the scale, and this is what their parents say about who their young people with disabilities are. We asked them about happiness. I think my child is happy. 93% of the parents said that describes my child as either somewhat or extremely like my child. My child seems to enjoy life and is thankful for life's simple pleasures. The vast majority of parents describe their young person like that. My child has a nice sense of humor. My child can be thoughtful or helpful to others. My child is caring to others. My child shows thanks for help from others. My child is concerned or upset when someone else is uncomfortable or distressed. I think my child's courageous. My child bounces back easily. My child does not retaliate or get back at others who've hurt him or her. My child doesn't lose his temper. Gifts like happiness, enjoyment, humor, kindness, caring, thankfulness. Can we find a place for those gifts in our congregations? I'm pretty sure we can if we introduce something in those terms. It really does matter how we introduce young people. Consider two introductions. Meet John. He has an intellectual disability. He can't read, and he's going to need lots of help to get around. Versus, have you met John? He's got an incredible sense of humor. He has a zest for life. He loves meeting new people, and he's got an unforgettable bear hug. Can we find a place for someone like that in our congregation? The answer is probably yes. So how do we equip congregational leaders and members to begin to see people first in terms of the gifts that they have to bring? And is your congregation filled with people who possess these qualities that you see on the screen? Or would you like it to be? And if so, I can suggest some new invitations you might want to extend. We also asked parents about the faith and spiritual expressions of these young people with disabilities. We already know intuitively, we don't need a study to tell us, but the presence of a disability label is in no way a predictor of the importance of faith in the lives of people. There was a survey in 2000 by the National Organization on Disability that surveyed Americans with and without disabilities, about 1,000 of each. And they found that virtually an identical number of people with and without disabilities considered their faith to be somewhat or very important in their lives. And this is also true. We heard the same message from the parents of these 242 young adults. When we asked about the place of faith in the lives of their children, half to 2/3 of youth were said to have prayed daily, to look to their faith as a means of as providing meaning and purpose in their lives, as considering themselves to be active in a congregation, as enjoying being around others who share their faith, and of having a faith that impacts their decision. So back to those questions that I raised earlier in my talk, how would you really, is faith really something that matters to young people with developmental disabilities? How would we really even know? Well, you just talk to them and talk to their families, and I think that's what you'll find. Those of you who know much more about faith formation of youth can probably speak to whether these patterns are very typical of adolescents without disabilities. So faith seems to matter to young people with developmental disabilities, just as it might for any young person. But how is that faith expressed by someone who might not talk, or who might use a communication device, or who might need extra support to express their spirituality at home or beyond the walls of their congregation? Well, you're likely to find the very same diversity of expressions reflected as you would among any group of young people. And so we asked these parents about the extent to which their child participates in any of 26 different spiritual activities or practices that might suggest faith is important to them. And here's just a sampling. We found that more than half of these young people prayed or listened to scriptures daily or weekly. More than 1/3 conversed about spiritual issues, or listened to religious music, or practiced a daily, weekly day of rest, or contributed money to their faith community, or prayed with members of their families. The vast majority of young people were described as engaging in one or more of these practices. So faith plays out in the homes and in the communities and the family lives of these young people. That's the story that parents are telling us. But there's a somewhat different story when you turn to what happens within the walls of a congregation. How well are these young people whose faith is important and their faith is clearly evident in everyday life, how well are they woven into the life of their congregation? We see a somewhat different picture that emerges when we ask parents about church inclusion and congregational inclusion. We found the very high percentage of these youth attended worship services regularly, but only 1/3 fewer attended religious education programs. So that means that more than 1/3 weren't part of any of the religious education programs in their congregation. When it came to youth groups, nearly 2/3 were not part of their congregation's youth group. Models for inclusive youth groups seem to really be particularly lacking. Those of you who will be here for the week will hear from Ben Connor, who's written some compelling work about inclusive youth ministry. Youth were much less often in other activities that made up everyday congregational life. And you see that by the large bars of yellow that reference never being part of those activities. And I've put these in your handouts as well, so you can look at them a little bit more closely later. And we'll have time to discuss some of these in the afternoon discussion sessions. But faith that plays out richly in the lives of these young people at home and in their families, we struggle to find a place for many of these young people in our churches. So look at the differences between those two figures, just noticing the yellow between individual practices and those corporate practices. Perhaps these findings reflect a general struggle of congregations to engage any youth or any young adults, or perhaps they reflect a need to be much more intentional about the supports and opportunities we provide to young people with disabilities specifically. And I'll share with you in just a moment what parents said about the kinds of supports that might bridge those two figures. But for those of you who are committed to helping young people with disabilities flourish, you might wonder how their faith relates to their strengths and their overall well-being and their family's quality of life. If you start to correlate these measures, and I know there's all kinds of problems with measuring these important things, but you'll see they're highly positively correlated. That when supports are in place for people to practice their faith, their well-being and quality of life is also considered to be much, much higher. So let's turn now to parents and the ways in which congregations might support them in raising their children with disabilities. It's clear also that faith has a central place in the lives of many families and many parents of children with disabilities, just as it does for any parents. More than 3/4 of the parents who are part of our project say they pray daily, that they look to their faith as providing meaning and purpose in their lives, that they consider themselves to be active members of their congregation, that they enjoy being around others who share their faith, and that they have a faith that impacts many of their decisions. And so it's not surprising that they're looking to their congregations as an important source of strength and support in meeting the challenges of raising a child with a disability. And we asked them to tell them about the religious tradition with which they most closely identify. It became very clear that while we have much religious diversity in our state, the Baptists are really showing up for this project. They're really showing up. But not every family that you're going to support is going to associate with a particular religious tradition or even any faith at all. But many, many do. And those of you who are working within service systems, really understanding the place and importance of faith in the lives of these families is really part of being culturally competent and providing culturally competent services. These parents are involved in faith communities quite actively. Many, 2/3, attend weekly or monthly. I suspect it's true of this audience here collectively. They attended small and medium and large and mega congregations. So what would these families, these parents tell us that they would find most helpful from their congregation as they raise a child with a disability? What very practical things could a congregation do in this particular area? So you might be surprised to know there are 335,000 churches, synagogues, and mosques in the United States alone. Those of you who are from Nashville know that about 300,000 of them are in Nashville proper, and there's a few in Wheaton, and then I think other cities have them as well, right? So here's what the families told us. We asked these parents to consider a variety of supports that their church, for example, might conceivably provide. And assuming that it was actually available, we asked them to tell us how helpful each would be to them personally as they raise their child with a disability. And these are going to be, there's a very concrete, practical support steps that congregations could take. And they're kind of ordered from those that are considered most helpful on down. So we found 3/4 of these parents said that having disability awareness efforts in their congregation would make a difference, a substantial difference in helping them in terms of raising and supporting their child. The emphasis on congregation-wide disability awareness, I think, is quite striking, and it really speaks to the importance of attitudinal change and speaks to what comes from the pulpit, certainly, as well. But other supports that were also affirmed by these parents. Nearly 3/4 said having an advocate in the congregation to work specifically with families, sometimes called a congregational coach, could make a huge difference. Sponsoring a support group for parents, having a resource center for families with disabilities. Spiritual counseling from a congregational leader was mentioned as being helpful from more than almost 2/3 of these families. Respite care, modifications to religious education programs, a spiritual or a religious education support plan, having someone to support their child during religious education services or during worship services. Some mentioned special worship services for people with disabilities. We can talk about that this afternoon in our discussion time. Some mentioned financial support from a congregation or transportation. And the thing that was helpful but identified as least helpful was a congregation that is more physically accessible. So when it comes to congregational welcome, we often talk about physical accessibility, and too often I think we end there. So this is certainly not to be overlooked, but it wasn't the most prominent support these families identified here. Now, there's great variability here, and so we have to ask really good questions. What would help you and your family to feel welcome here? What could we do that would make this youth group the best part of the week for your child? And for each of these potential supports, in addition to asking parents what could be helpful, we said, to what extent are these available right now in your congregation? These findings depict a real opportunity for congregations to meet felt needs. In the small orange circles that are very difficult to read is the percentage of congregations that offered these supports right now. Only 6% had disability awareness efforts. Only 4% of these congregations had an advocate to work with families. Only 9% had a support groups for families. Only 28% of parents said they had access to spiritual support from a congregational leader, which means 3/4 did not, and all the way down. So many opportunities for congregations to really meet felt needs among families of youth and young adults with disabilities. And finally, and probably way too briefly, I'll just end with a picture of how parents viewed just a few indicators of inclusion in their particular congregation. For those parents who were attending a congregation, we asked them to share the extent to which they agreed with each of the following statements. At my congregation, people with intellectual disabilities and autism are present during our worship services. That was true for about 3/4 of these congregations. People with intellectual disabilities or autism actually interact with other members without disabilities during these worship services, a bit less. The percentage of parents who said, at my congregation, people with intellectual disabilities and autism are attending our religious education programs, only about 57%, and even fewer of those young people interacted with others within those religious education programs. We asked about their perceptions about how well their child was accepted by congregational leaders and by other congregation members, and parents largely felt that their children were accepted by leaders and other congregation members. But when it came to their perceptions of whether the leadership in their congregation demonstrated a commitment to including people with disabilities, far few parents said this described their congregation. And a fairly small percentage, in my view, of these parents said that they were very satisfied with how welcoming others were of people with intellectual disabilities in their congregation. So that sort of gives a picture of how parents are experiencing and encountering their congregation and their perceptions of its inclusion and its welcome. So in terms of where we're going next, this is just an interim snapshot of the experiences of Tennessee families. We are hoping to involve another 250 families, and our team, which includes a couple of doctoral students who are here, Thomas Boehm and Naomi Annandale, we're going to shortly turn to interviewing about 50 of these families and young people to really understand better about how a congregation can support them and their families in truly flourishing. We're also going to begin to turn our focus more on the congregational side of the story to better understand how they're impacted by the presence and gifts and participation of people with disabilities. And our hope is to refine a reflection tool that congregations can use to identify starting points. Perhaps these are some things that we might partner with some of you on, and there can be things we talk about this afternoon in our discussion time. So let's come back to Chicago and to each of you, and how might you draw on this small snapshot of the lives of young people with disabilities and their families into your own work? Well, some of you who are already interested in or are already undertaking research and scholarship at the intersection of faith and disability, I hope these early findings might spur your own thinking about the types of data you could begin gathering to help us all enable us to know better how to support people with disabilities and their families in this dimension of their lives. And what questions do these data raise for you? What new questions and what roles might you play in finding some of those answers? But for those of you who are doing writing and speaking and workshops, perhaps these data can really further strengthen the calls that you're issuing to congregations to reach out in new and compelling ways to the many, many families that live in your midst. So what would spur a congregation or a network of congregations to begin offering some of those supports? Why would a church and its members start to get involved? Well, this is where your gifts as theologians and ministry leaders and seminarians are really important. You can begin to craft that sort of the argument for a compelling response here. And for those of you who are in the service system, I'm convinced that these findings further highlight the necessity of asking good questions in order to support young people with disabilities and their families well. Although I've aggregated all of these data together in these slides, that misrepresents things, because there are really 244 unique faith stories in this sample as well. There's not one story for people with disabilities and their families, and a particular disability label really tells us just about nothing about the place and importance of people's faith. And so for those of you who are working in service systems, asking good questions about what matters in people's lives is really important. I've written a little bit on that. Bill has as well, if you're looking for some of those kinds of questions. And then for those of you who are members of congregations, perhaps these findings might inform your work as you're designing and delivering ministries to families. Reflect on the supports that parents have identified as being most helpful for them, and think about then what your starting points or your next steps might be. So my time is running short, so I just will close by thanking Bill and David and Bethesda Institute for the invitation to join you today, and really the wonderful opportunity to dialogue and learn alongside with you this week. So I look forward to some of the discussions that we'll have ahead this afternoon and over meals this week, and thank you for your time and attention.